Okay, it is time to get started with the construction of this jacket. I have everything together here that I'm going to need for us to get started. It's all the things we've already been working on. Lots of bias strips that are ready to go. I've cut out all the pattern pieces, the fabric according to the new pattern that we modified using the Tate. I have also, I've got some pattern markings on my sleeve here, but I've also got a stitch all the way around the perimeter of each of my pattern pieces that is going to secure the quilting threads in place so that they don't become unstitched as we're going along. We don't want that to happen. The other thing I have here is, and I'm sure you're going to have this too, I have a whole lot of scraps of this fabric, and we are going to use this for practice. I think it's a good thing if you haven't done bindings before to have a few little practice pieces just to kind of work on your techniques before you actually do it on the jacket. So I'm going to show how to do it just using these two little rectangles here. It doesn't matter the size, you just need some straight edges. So we're going to do the bound seams first, and then we'll do it on the jacket. And then once we get to the bindings, we'll do the same thing. Do that on some scrap pieces just to test it out before doing it on the jacket. So come back with some scraps and we will get started learning how to do the bound seams. So let's talk about what a bound seam actually is. A bound seam is when the seam on the inside of a garment, the seam allowance, is actually wrapped around with bias binding. So this is actually the jacket that we are going to be making, and I've already done one of the shoulders just to demonstrate what it's going to look like when we get this first seam done. This jacket is going to have this pear pattern on the outside. It's going to be the opposite of the other one that I made, but this seam is already done with the bias binding. So if I open it up, normally if you open up a seam, this is the outside. If you open it up, you would have your, your seam allowance right here. And what I've done with this is I have wrapped it with bias, and it is bound with bias. So makes a really pretty inside of the jacket when you do this. So first thing that you do when you get started, remember I said we're going to do this using some scraps to start with. I'm going to demonstrate, but the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to pin it, and then I'm going to stitch, the seam that I am going to be binding or stitching together. I'm just going to stitch it across the regular way that the pattern calls for it to be stitched. So for this, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch all the way across here. The second step that I'm going to do, which is optional, but I'm going to tell you in case you decide you like to do that too. The second step is to zigzag this edge after you've done that. The reason that you would zigzag is that it keeps this seam just a little bit less puffy and bulky if it's zigzagged. But it's really not totally necessary. You can do it if you like to, but you don't have to. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to do my first stitch, then I'm going to zigzag, and then come back and we will do the bias on it. So the stitching and the zigzag across this edge has been done. The next thing is to get your bias strip out and cut a length that is exactly the width of the seam that you are going to bind. So there's what I've got. Now I'm going to unfold it, open it up, and I am going to pin it across the edge with one raw edge right across the raw edge of my seam. Now I like to sew this from this side, not from the binding side, just because I am going to try to follow this previous stitching line with my next stitch. So I'm going to pin it here, and then we'll look on the back and make sure that everything is going to stitch just right. But let's get those in here. Okay, so I've got it pinned here in place, and then I've got the binding you can see right there on the edge. So I'm going to go to my machine, and I'm going to stitch across here right along the stitching line where I previously had stitched the two pieces of fabric together. After that, I'm going to come back. So the bias band has been stitched onto the fabric right there at the stitching line for that we used to stitch the seam together. Now I'm going to take this bias that was already pre-folded and pressed, and I'm just going to wrap it around the back side. And this is what's going to bind the seam together. You can see this is the front side where we've already stitched, and then this side is back around here. Now the goal for this back side is for the folded edge to be right there at that stitch line, maybe a little bit past it. So what you need to do is just kind of fold it over and see where it hits along that stitch. Sometimes, depending upon the width of your seam, you may have an area where it seems like your binding is a little bit too wide, like maybe like that might look. And that's okay. All you need to do is just fold it down in that area to where it is a consistent length all the way across, and it ends right there where that stitching is. So once you have that, then you can pin this in place. This is a situation where people who use wonder clips might like this, to do this with wonder clips, but pins also work just fine. It's certainly not something you need to buy wonder clips for just for this, but if you have them, you might try using them. But anyway, so now I'm going to come back and I am going to stitch across the front side that we have already stitched about 1/16 of an inch away from the edge on the binding, and that should catch the binding in the back. The goal is for it to be a straight line, relatively consistent. You know, would this stitch be from where it is stitched to the edge also? But this is the seam that gets a little bit tricky to get looking just right, so that's why I'm having you practice a little bit. But go ahead and do that stitching and come back and we will see what we've got and probably move on to the next step. So here's what I have. Got the stitching bias bound along there. I'm just showing you what both sides look like. This is what the outside will look like, just a regular seam, but this is what the inside is going to look like. Now, let's just assume this is the shoulder seam. And so what that means is we're going to have another seam over on this side. So what you always do when you finish with your seam is, of course, trim the edges, get those little stitches, you know, your little threads clipped. But another thing I like to do, if I know that there's another, you know, that I'm going to have another bound seam along here, is clip it at a very slight angle. Not a lot, but just a little bit on the edge. And that's going to help us later with not quite so much bulk, because, you know, once we get to doing the next seam, this is going to be, this right here, which is going to be thicker, of course, is going to be included in our next bound seam. So we want there to be just a very slight diagonal cut there to make it not quite so bulky. The other thing is you do need to be sure, like especially on the shoulder seam, that you go on and press this towards the back, and that's going to help it hold flatter as you go to doing your next bound seam. So moving to the jacket with a bound seam, since we've already done our practicing, we're going to go on and do the shoulder seams here. Now I've already shown you that I've done this one, but the next thing to do for you is to put your right sides together of your jacket, do your stitching across each shoulder, do the zigzag if you would like to do that, and then you do the bound seam using your bias. You know, you'll cut it to this width right here and do it just like we did on the practice, enclosing both of these seams. And when you come back, it'll be time to move to the sleeve. So shoulders are stitched, we have the bound seams, and they are pressed towards the back. Next thing is just to go ahead and put our sleeve in like we normally would, according to the directions on the pattern. Now, remember we have some X's on our sleeve and we have a dot. Be sure that you have those. And once you've done that, the instructions say that you're going to sew some gathering stitches between the X's, you know, like a long stitch length, and that's going to help us fit this sleeve into the jacket. It's not really a gathered or puff sleeve at all. It just gives us a little bit of ease to work with in order to get everything into the right place. So what I'm going to do after that is just pin it in place. And it's really just like putting any other seam in. It just happens to be a lot thicker, bulkier fabric. But Make sure that you have your fronts and your backs the right way. And so this is my B for my back sleeve, and here is the back of my jacket. And I am just going to start pinning down here. I have already done my gathering stitches. I'm going to start pinning down here, and I'm just going to pin my first 3 points together, which would be my dot up at the shoulder, which is right here at that seam, and then each of the ends. And I've got my right sides together. I keep second guessing myself on this fabric because the last one I made, I had the other side as the front of the jacket. So anyway, I'm having to think a little bit more on this one as I do it. So now you can see that there's a little bit more fabric here that needs to be pulled up to fit into this space. Let me put another pin right here at the X on each side. And then I'm just going to pull these threads to make this fit into this space. And it's really not a lot of pulling that I'm going to have to do, just to give it a little bit less, just a tiny bit of gathering. And you can see there's really going to hardly be any, but that's actually almost a pretty good fit there. Once I have it pulled up where I think it's about right, I'm going to go ahead and just wrap around this pin down here to secure those threads, and then move them around up here so that they're all kind of spread out. We don't really want there to be gathers along the sleeve, and if we spread this gathering out, it won't even really look that way. It's just going to look smooth once it's stitched in place. So that looks actually pretty good there. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this and then go to the other side and do the same thing from this end. After I have gotten it all pulled up and my edges matching, then I'm going to go and I'm going to stitch with my 1/4 inch seam allowance along there, and then I'm going to zigzag the entire seam also. So we're ready to do the bound seam on this next armhole curved seam. After the last step, you know, we stitched it in place and did the zigzagging. So the next thing is going to be to cut a strip of bias this length. And this is going to be exactly the same technique that we used when we, when we did these shoulder seam bound seams. But I will say that the shoulder seam bound seams are the easiest ones you're going to do. This one is a little bit more complicated just because you have curves going in both direction on the sleeve, but it is exactly the same technique. A few pointers to say. I've already done this one and it turned out just fine, but just to give you a few additional things to say about this, be very sure that your seam allowance on this entire seam is very consistent. Sometimes on curves, and also dealing with this thicker fabric, it's a little bit, it's different than probably what most of us are so used to sewing on all the time. So just be careful that you've got a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, so that when you get ready to do your bias binding, that it is a consistent overlap all the way around. It does, bias by its nature does have a little bit of a stretch, and there may be some areas where you're actually stretching it a little bit as you go around. I had told you before that I liked to pin the bias in place and then stitch from the back side, and that is just my personal preference. If you prefer to pin the bias in place and stitch from the front side, there is no problem in doing that. The reason I do the back side is that I like to stitch right along my previous stitching line, but if you want to do from the other side and just do a good 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, that might be a little bit easier for some people, just to keep you from, just to enable you to keep the bias lined up very well. use a lot of pins as you pin everything on, and then go on and stitch this first seam, and we'll do the wrapping around after that. So I have this first stitching of this bias seam in place along this arm to shoulder seam, and now all I have to do is just flip it around to the back side, and then we're going to top stitch it in place. Now there may be areas where your seam allowance is a little bit shorter than others. Hopefully it's about the same everywhere, but as we turn around to the back, it is ideal if your binding has a pretty snug fit over your seam allowance. So if there's a place where it seems like your binding is going to be a little bit wide, you can always, roll it and fold it down just a little bit more to make that be a snug fit. Since the bias is stretchy, you can do that. I'm going to put that pin in from another direction. You can do that and it doesn't affect your final product with it. But sometimes you will have to, it's also partially because we have binding that's a little bit wider than our seam allowance, that we may have some areas where we need to fold it in a little bit more as we're going. And so we're just going to do this all the way around. Lots of pins. I'm going to end up putting a whole lot more pins in than I have here, but I'm going to go all the way around with lots of pins, and then I'm going to stitch from this top side to get that top stitching done. So I'm all finished with the bound seams at the top of the shoulder and all the way around the shoulder and armhole. After you finish that, press your seam allowance toward the sleeve and remove the gathering threads. As you remove the gathering threads, be very careful that you don't accidentally remove quilting threads. These quilting threads on this fabric are actually probably about the length of a normal gathering thread, maybe a 4 to 5 on your sewing machine. So it would be really easy to mistake a quilting thread for a gathering thread. So just be careful as you do that. And the next thing we're going to do is go for the bound seam on the next and last inside seams that we have. So putting right sides together, this is the front of the jacket with the back of the jacket and then the sleeve. And we're going to do this long seam right here. That's going to have a little bit of a pivot point right here underneath the arm, where you are going to have the two bound seams from either side coming together. I've already done this side. I'm going to give you a few pointers. I'm not going to go over every little detail like we've done on the others because it's really just the same technique that we've already done. But so the main thing to know is about this pivot point in the middle. It is best if you have not trimmed it already, hopefully you haven't. If you haven't trimmed your seam allowances on your binding super short, don't do that yet. Just leave them where they extend straight out a little bit. If you haven't done that already, it's not a problem if you have, but might make it easier if you haven't. But you're going to put these places together right where your two seams are together, and they are both ironed this direction, but as you stitch them, you want to stitch one where it's facing toward the sleeve and the other where the binding is going towards the body of the jacket. And that is going to decrease the bulk in this area as you put the binding around all of this. So when you stitch it for the first time, your first seam, be sure that you stitch it that way, with one of the seams going this way and one of the seam allowances going the other way. And that will help. Also being sure that you catch the end of, all of the raw edges are inside your seam allowance for your bindings at this area. Then whenever you go to actually do the bias binding, I found it easiest just to almost straighten this out, and it actually does it pretty well. You will have a pivot point up in here, but I pretty much just treated it as a straight seam all the way down, and it worked out just fine. On this one, you can see how it looks, and it bends and pivots just fine here on this other one. So that's the plan here. Go ahead and take care of doing all the bound seams on the very last two seams that you have, the one under the arm and to the sides. And once we are done with that, you need to iron them towards the back of the jacket, and then we will move on to the seams on the outside.